The Brendan O'Connor Show on RTE Radio 1 with All Care Pharmacy. Advice and expertise on the relief you need from hay fever at All Care community pharmacies across Ireland.
My next guest has just published his latest book. It's called The Pages. Hugo Hamilton, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And Hugo, I suppose one theme of The Pages is kind of how we're all our stories, and maybe the stories of the people who came before us as well, and they echo down through us, and we all carry our shrapnel, I suppose, in us as well, which is very true of you and people who've read possibly your best known book, The Speckled People, which was your story. And it was the story of a very bizarre upbringing. So maybe for people who don't know, let's revisit that a bit first. So tell us about your dad. Your mother was German and your father was from Cork, but kind of ironically, he was the authoritarian one in the house.
Yeah, my mother came from Germany after the war to Ireland on a pilgrimage and met this very eccentric Cork man and decided to marry him. And she didn't really know what she was getting into. In Ireland, because he wanted to promote the Irish language, and so he was a German speaker. He had learned German, and but he wouldn't allow any English into the house. So that was very difficult for my mother. She became very isolated in some way because of this kind of ideological, cultural warfare that he got into. And of course, he was very authoritarian and very strict.
And that cultural warfare, as you call it, he was quite hardline with the kids as well, wasn't he, around matters linguistic and stuff?
Oh yes, he just wouldn't allow a single word. Even the word fruit comes, we weren't allowed in the house.
Yeah.
I think back on it now, like it was a sort of a strange cultural or multicultural experiment that my parents were involved in. At a very early stage when there were no foreign people living in Ireland at all. So we looked very strange. It didn't help that my mother, ordered these lederhosen in from Germany, and we had to wear lederhosen and iron sweaters to mark out the cultural diversity that we were in.
So you're an actual visual parody of the two nations put together.
Absolutely,
basically.
there are photographs of us there in that gear.
Yeah, and of course, then you were tormented by the other kids for being German as they saw it as well. Then,
well, that's it. We were the most unusual sight on the buses and on the streets of Dunleary, and it was very funny. It wasn't funny for us or for my mother particularly, because I was called Eichmann and my brother was called Hitler, and we then sort of got regularly executed. So we had to constantly watch out where we were, and that was difficult to live with. It sort of
and it did like you speak about it kind of lightly enough now, but it had a huge effect on you. You must have been very confused and traumatized and all those things.
Yeah, it was. At the end effect, really, it made us very silent. I think it was the language as much as anything. I never knew what language to speak. I always had to look over my shoulder. Could I speak English now? In the house, of course, I couldn't. On the street, I couldn't say anything in German. Which was actually my mother tongue. So I was in this sort of strange, in-between country. Like I had the outsider inside me, so...
And when you say German was your mother tongue, so did you think in German? That was your primary language, kind of, was it?
It was, yes. That's the language I grew up. My father also spoke German at home in the kitchen. So I describe it in The Speckled People as this being born and growing up in Germany. And then looking out the window and seeing this strange country outside where they spoke a different language.
Yeah. So the last time I met you was 20 years ago. I interviewed you about The Speckled People, and I did remember thinking at the time, geez, I thought I was shy, but this guy is kind of like awkward enough, but I only kind of found out afterwards that really it was only after you wrote the book and that you started speaking, that before that, even right up to adult years, you were just this kind of silent person, yeah?
Well, that's it. I couldn't open my mouth, even as a sort of an adult, a young adult. And, it was almost a came to the point like where I was denying my German mother and didn't want anybody to know anything about my childhood. So a lot of my friends didn't even know that I had this weird childhood.
Yeah. So you
my
were
children,
pushing so much down there, like that you were virtually paralyzed by it, like.
Yes, you could say that. I was certainly paralysed as a speaker. I couldn't say anything. I remember being in pubs in Dublin, and I would say strange things that nobody understood. I was very eccentric. Everything I said didn't sound right. You know, if I told a joke, the punchline came out wrong. It just like it offended people. It was just like I was almost like speaking in English, but sort of with a German syntax underneath.
Yeah. So you weren't at home really in the world at all, were you? Like.
No. So the great relief for me was really to become a writer. It was the only escape route for somebody like me, and that's the only place where I could get some success with language. Like I could plan out my thoughts and plan out my sentences, and people have said about me that I'm very careful with words, but I had to be, you know. And
are you at home more in the world now as you get on?
Well, yes, I've been practicing English for a long time, you know. So, and
I believe even your own kids like thought you were a bit of a weirdo. Yeah,
I think so. Yes, I mean, weirdo is a term I answer to. You know, I even sing that Radiohead song like where I'm a weirdo, I don't belong here. You know.
Yeah. The father repented later in life, did he?
Well, he did. I think he understood the damage or the kind of hardship he caused us as children, and because I eventually rebelled, and you know, it became this kind of door slamming war at home, and but I think for my mother it was particularly difficult. She became very isolated here in Ireland, didn't have any friends, was locked into this kind of conscripted into this kind of war that my father carried out, and you know, I think she was very homesick, I think, for Germany, and constantly told us about the small town that she came from. So it's perhaps from her that I've inherited that homesickness as well.
Yeah, because you can tell the way you write in the pages just about the textures of Germany, the sounds and the smells and everything. You write about it with relish, like you obviously you hum with Germany, do you? Yeah,
I do. I mean, it's sort of. When I grew up, I knew the landscape of my mother's town much better than my own landscape of Dunleary. I felt at home there. Yes, it was a kind of an escape for me, and it's sort of this. And I think it's interesting, like that when I wrote The Speckled People, it was this great liberation, not just for me, but also for my family. This silent story suddenly became public, and it became it was out there on the page. And I remember, you know, there is such a thing as being sick with happiness. I mean, when The Speckled People was published, I was sick for months after that. And I couldn't tell why, because I should be happy, I should be well now. But I remember Nuala Fuelon telling me that when her book went onto the bestseller list in New York, all she could do for weeks on end was cry. She sat in her room and cried. And I suppose it's something about people listening to her that sort of suddenly released, and she felt comfortable for the first time.
And then it all came out, kind of everything she'd been holding in or whatever in the body for years,
Yeah, so there is this thing about sort of being sick with happiness or sick with relief, that somebody's finally listening to you and that you're able to speak.
Yeah, wow. So then the funny thing is, though, that you do kind of keep going back to the scene of the crime in a way, in that you, like, you went and got a job in Gaelic then, like, considering your experience with the Irish language. And then again with the pages now, you're back to Germany as well.
Well, these are I mean, these are the unanswered questions that it's the source material for a writer. I have to I have to understand German history. I grew up, going back and forth between Irish history and German history. It's a sort of that's where my source material is. Like I need to understand that my German side,
Yeah, yeah. And you now spend, would you spend half your time in Germany and half your time in Dublin, or?
No, I live most of the time here in
Okay.
Ireland, but I go to Berlin quite often. I need to go there. I need to say the names of cakes and walk into bakeries and, feel at home, I'm back in the kitchen with my mother again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So explain to people. I mean, you don't want to give too much away either, but the pages, which I don't just say this to everyone, I think is a wonderful book. The lead character is, quite curiously, is a book really, but just explain to people what it is.
Well, it's an idea that came to me. It's a true story. That came through family connections in Germany, where a book had been rescued from the Nazi book burning in May 1933, and that book was kept safe through the Nazi years. And I held that book in my hand a couple of years ago, and it was thrilling to think about this book that had been published in 1924. A book called Rebellion by Joseph Roth, the Austrian Jewish author. And it was thrilling to hold that book in my hand and sort of think like all of the people who had touched it, these thumbprints, dead and alive, in the book. And to imagine the book then telling its own story. So that was the literary trick that I kind of came up with as a writer.
Yeah. And in a way, there's a few pointed times where the book says, I wish I could warn people, because the book sees more than the people see. And the book would love to warn people now and again about things, but it can't, obviously, because it can't tell them what's on its mind. But I felt you were kind of saying that, like, there are books do have warnings for us and history of warnings for us, but that we don't always hear them or listen to them. There's a touch of that, is there?
Well, there is. The book obviously can't speak directly to the person that's holding it. But it can, through the reading, tell people that, history is in danger of repeating itself. And, all of the things that happened in the 1930s, the witness, this is kind of like the book is a first-hand witness to history. There are signals of those things happening again in our lifetime.
Do you feel there are, yeah?
Yes, there are. It's easy to overstate,
Yeah, we don't want to be dramatic either or diminish what happened in the 30s either with comparisons. But
no, you don't want to overstate that. But there are, scary things about the social media and the technologies that are there, like that do echo in some way. The new technologies of the 1930s, like the radio suddenly becoming straight into your home. And these autocratic voices being able to speak to people directly. And the whole way that we sort of deal with the truth now, it's sometimes, the truth is boring. And like we love to hear the sort of the person with the conspiracy theory, the fire starter.
Yeah,
somebody
it's a bit
saying something,
sexier,
saying something so really outrageous and eccentric. They sound better than the people telling the truth, So there is a danger in some way that we're sort of lured into that sort of conspiracy.
Yeah. And listen, there are kind of a weaving together of lots of things in it and things down the years and everything. But I know one thing that was kind of very important to you was Joseph Roth's wife, was it Friedel? Friederike?
Friederike, yeah.
Yeah, Friederike. You can, I suppose, like I remember there was a book by a woman who was involved with Jack Kerouac once, and she called the book Minor Characters because the women were always minor characters for the Beat generation and for lots of writers, I think. And I think you wanted to take Friederike from being a minor character and kind of give her moment in a way, give her story her moment. Did you?
I did. Everybody knows the story of Joseph Roth. He was a Jewish author, like, who fled Berlin and lived his life in exile, like a sort of an itinerant refugee. But all of that sort of moving around, like he lived in hotels, he lived out of a suitcase, And that sort of caused a lot of trouble for his wife. And she then became sort of very ill, mentally ill. And it was eventually, it became schizophrenic and had to be institutionalized in, and I thought, her life was never really kind of written properly by biographers. She was in the shadow of his, great life as an author. So I took her life. I wanted to promote her as the central character in this novel. And I then at some stage, came across the case notes in the Vienna psychiatric institutions, and they were extraordinary. Like, it was extraordinary listening to her voice, talking to the doctors about all the different things that happened to her. There was even a photograph of her, those mugshot photographs that you get in sort of of criminals, like one from the side and one from the front, with her head shaven and everything like that. So it was a tragic story, and
in a way, you seem to kind of suggest he keeps writing her all the time as different female characters in his books. But almost a sense of that the writer is a vampire to the people around him, because as he keeps writing her, she becomes more and more diminished, and he frantically rewrites her more and more as this fictional character.
Well, that probably applies to all authors.
That's what I was thinking.
We have a sort of a strange relationship to reality, but he was particularly like that. He not only wrote her in most of his books as characters, but also, I think, tried to write her in real life and tried to reconstruct her as a different person. She came from a very poor background, spoke in this kind of Viennese dialect, and I think he tried to reconstruct her as a sort of a noblewoman and who a literary expert.
Okay, so to write her as kind of egomaniacal, kind of sociopath as well, like who gets so used to controlling the universe on the page that he can't quite give that up in real life. Yeah,
that's exactly it. I think that does apply to all authors in some ways, that we kind of try and control the world that we live in. If it doesn't match up to our novels, it doesn't.
Yeah, if the arc isn't right, you have to fix it. Another thread that's in it, and I suppose we're back to your father here, is that wrote himself, quite a controlling individual. The main character, Lena, her boyfriend Mike, is controlling in that very modern way of her phone and all that kind of stuff. And there's a few other examples of it, but I thought it was interesting. There's a character, what was it, Jürgen, the psychotherapist, and he said they're at the book club discussing Roth's book, but they're talking about this kind of thing, and he says, well, male inadequacy leads to aggression, others bottle it up. And I think at the time they kind of feel he's making excuses, but that's clearly you're thinking about your father all the time. And is it inadequacy there, you think, that makes men do a lot of the things they do?
It's a strange. It's hard to explain that, but I watched that in my father. Like, I mean, he was so controlling. You couldn't make a cup of tea in our house without him knowing about it. And I think that's something in the male psyche in some ways. Like, this kind of narcissism, this inability to let go, and it's almost obsessional with some men. This need to control. I don't know. It's something we need to watch in ourselves. I think, as men.
Do you have the tendency?
Well, I saw it in my father, and I needed to change that in myself. This. I mean, it's a strange thing. Male desire and male love. Like, it is almost sometimes becomes sort of a statement of ownership. I think it's something, that changed a lot with John Lennon and people like that. That generation that I grew up with changed all of that. We maybe got away from that sort of autocratic male viewpoint. But I think it's still there in society, and I think men need to watch that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about wanting to be different from your father, and like there is threads in the book as well of how trauma comes down the generations, and I think that one of the characters, like you talk about how that the trauma is there in him and it could explode at any time. I presume with your own children, your whole thing was like, I don't be like my father, don't be like my father, yeah?
Well, that's it. You know, I was, you know, concerned, like I didn't want to pass on, particularly the language problems. You know, I allowed them to speak anything. They were allowed basically to do anything except smoke. You know.
Okay, yeah.
Because
yeah.
that's
reasonable. Yeah.
That was a good advice to them. But yeah, I think you can subliminally pass on things to children. I think that happens anyway. You know, I think, you know, I wonder even generations down, are we still sort of, German people, are they still worried about bombs falling on cities? Are they, you know, there are subliminal things that are passed on down generations, and
in the unconscious. Like,
yeah, particularly for German people, the guilt and the trauma of the war, all of that is still there, you know, and needs to be processed in some way, you know.
Yeah. The book, there's a feel of a movie off it, like, and it has that great climactic scene and everything that you can almost see visually happening. Has it been optioned?
Well, yeah, I think Neil Jordan is very keen to do this book,
okay.
You know, so we'll see. Anyway, we're
yeah, that's the first step on about a million steps, I know, to when you're actually at Cannes at your premiere.
You need a lot of luck and spit, as my mother used to say, you know, to make a movie, you know. So, but I'm just thrilled, you know, the book is out there at the moment, you know.
Yeah, and listen, it is great, and actually for people on a staycation or anything, great book, transports you off into another world completely, and a lot of thought provoking stuff in it. So Hugo, great to catch up again after all this time, and the book is called The Pages. Thank you very much, Hugo Hamilton, and we're going to take a break, I think.
Email brendan@rte.ie